Now, more than 15 years since global treaty to combat human trafficking was adopted, nearly 46 million people are enslaved. And that's according to the 2016 Global Slavery Index published on Tuesday. The index by Australia-based human rights group Walk Free Foundation increased its estimate of people born into servitude, trafficked for sex work, or trapped in debt, bondage, or forced labor to nearly 46 million from about 36 million in 2014. Andrew Forrest, founder of Walk Free, said the rise of nearly 30% was due to better data collection, although he feared the situation was getting worse with global displacement and migration, increasing vulnerability to all forms of slavery. Now, for some insight into global slavery, I'm joined by Terry Fitzpatrick, Communication Director at Free the Slaves, a U.S.-based organization dedicated to ending all forms of slavery. Mr. Fitzpatrick, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, welcome. We're happy to have you with us. And one of the things that confuses people is what is what is slavery? Because people always have this idea that it is, just a trade where people are literally sold and held in bondage.
Sure. Slavery has changed the nature of slavery from, say, 150 years ago, when Africans were kidnapped from throughout the continent, put on slave ships, and then sent to the Americas or into Europe. Now, people are enslaved largely in place, or they deliver themselves to Europe or to America where they are enslaved. So slavery never really went away. It has just taken different forms. And slavery never ended. It was outlawed. When the end of the transatlantic slave trade ended 150 years ago, it was made illegal, but it was never really eradicated. And that's why we see these reports, and that's why we still have the problem today.
And now, looking at this report, of course, it says it's kind of expanded the groups that would be considered being in some form of slavery.
Yes.
In terms of, like Africa, we have looked at so many things that sometimes, make you wonder what is what? What are your assessment of
what
the situation
is slavery?
In Africa?
Well, Africa is one of the world's hotspots for slavery, particularly parts of West Africa, Central Africa, and say South Africa and the southern tip of Africa. And that's because of particular vulnerabilities. This is real slavery. People, say, are migrating and get tricked by a trafficker. There are millions of people moving from poor areas to wealthier cities or from poorer countries to wealthier ones looking to send money back home. And this is a largely unregulated, unpoliced flow of people around the world. And when traffickers pose as legitimate labor recruiters, and when they get people away from home, away from their countries, away from their support networks, they're trapped. Also, it's debt. People fall into debt because they don't have access to health care. They don't have better policing to keep people, traffickers at bay. There's conflict, which kind of interrupts the rule of law and access to justice and education systems. Or there's climate shock from climate change. And people find themselves without resilience to withstand some kind of emergency, or they have to borrow money from someone. And then
to pay back.
And then they have to work it off. And once they get to the mine or to the rubber plantation or to the timber cutting operation, that's when the hammer drops.
Now, strictly on the definition of that word, slavery, I mean, there are people who are in a form of slavery, but they don't think so, or who are actually slave owners or who are trading in slavery, but they don't think of themselves as such.
It's true. Awareness is, in the United States and Europe has grown from that there is a global problem to now that there is a global solution. But where slavery is worst, there is not as much awareness right now that this isn't just the way things are, that there is hope, and that this actually is illegal by United Nations treaties, and every country, including every country in Africa, has passed a law making this illegal. So it's not just the UN telling Africa what to do, it's African countries themselves saying that this is illegal. But people haven't necessarily heard that if they're in remote villages or if they're in conflict zones. Or, say, in the case of Boko Haram, where there are raids, where girls are kidnapped and sold into sex slavery.
How can you, what's your thought of on the issue of this migration now? We're seeing the influx of people going to Europe.
Well, sure. There's a difference between migration and smuggling of people and trafficking them with the intent to enslave them when they get there. So much of what's happening in Europe is actually migration, not actually human trafficking for the purpose of enslaving them in Europe. Some people will end up, unfortunately, in slavery when they get there because they're vulnerable. But most of the traffic is people moving away from conflict zones in the Middle East through an African route, or from Africa into Europe for better economic chances. The good news is, though, even though this is a global problem and there are tens of millions of people, which is more than there ever were 150 years ago, in slavery, we can solve this. Better policing, reduce the demand for products that are made by slavery, and then cut off the supply of vulnerable people in the systems of slavery by empowering people at a village level. That will do it. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you very much, and that's the kind of good work you're doing.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Terry. Terry Fitzpatrick is the Communications Director at the U.S.-based Free the Slaves organization.